Well, now of course he's tying it into population control, which um, is actually not um, as crazy as you might suspect. Now we need to, if we're going to talk about population control, we need to recognize that there is two things, or that there are two things of concern. The first thing that's of concern is the idea of political centralization. Um, and anybody that opposes political centralization will use, or will find some benefit in using scary ideas like population control to fight against political centralization. And I'm not in favor of political centralization myself either. Um, but this is certainly a part of the reason you see, population control scaremongering attached to anti-UN rants coming from um, uh, people that are opposed to um, uh, global integration and governing, often because they fear that as a threat to their own wealth. Right. So there's that aspect of it, and there's the other side of it, which is that um, we've been lucky. We have avoided the Malthusian nightmare um, through the use of oil, refrigeration techniques, oil-based pesticides specifically. Um, we have managed to do amazing things with science to feed increasingly large populations. And whatever number you want to put on it, no sane person can look at the situation and say, we can just let things keep growing forever. So, given that truth, it's not a question of if we will reach a point of catastrophe and have large die offs. It's a question of when and how you deal with it. I'm consequently not at all opposed to the idea of um, collectively working together to find ways to ensure that our population growth it does not get out of hand. Um, where it becomes a problem is in the methods that have been used and could possibly be used. The reality is that you don't need a scary, New World Order theory to present examples of population control um, that have been done egregiously, horribly. There are examples in the United States. The epicenter of liberal capitalism, where people have been targeted by the basis of their race and sterilized while they're in under routine procedures, or even been ordered sterilized by the courts. There's no um, political centralization underlying that. Um, in fact, it's largely the opposite. It's largely more the consequence of decentralized populations applying racial hygiene um, uh, practices as a consequence of white supremacism. Not as a consequence of state centralization, or orders being barked down from the other side of the country, but as a consequence of mob rule. So we don't really need to tie these ideas together. They don't really have much to do with each other. I think it's rather specious to suggest that global bodies are any more likely to carry out these sorts of approaches. If anything, the fact that there's so many more people involved in the decision-making process, and I mean, carrying something like that out. Um, if you're going to carry out sterilization practices in Alberta, then you just need a small mob of loonies to take over the government, and popular support from a certain segment of the population. And there you go. If you want to do a global sterilization routine, uh, or, or push it down from the top like that, you need massive collusion at huge levels. You need it implemented at the local level over huge distances. It seems so complex that I couldn't imagine it. If I was really concerned about this, I would be more concerned about mobs taking control. The descendants of the Ku Klux Klan, as one example, or white supremacists in Germany, not shady government bodies. Just due to the complexity of doing it, it's something that's much easier to do in a decentralized context than in a centralized context. So that largely takes the rug out from underneath the argument that is really driving this, because this is largely New World Order or anti-New World Order propaganda. It's the old, like I say, it's the old John Birch Society myth of the United Nations communists taking over the world kind of thing, right? Um, and like I say, if you look at history, not only is it the case that um, when these techniques have been carried out, they've been done through decentralization largely. It's also been the case that historically speaking, it's been mostly people on the right, or when it is people on the left, it's the so-called left, where they act in it, like the Stalinists, for example, were extreme authoritarian conservatives, right? So the whole thing, like I say, comes pulling out from underneath it. Um, this argument isn't really about Ebola. It's not really about sterilization. It's not really about population control. It's about world governance. And tying these things together is, I think, if you actually look at the evidence closely, entirely specious. Um, both things are of concern from different perspectives, but it's tying them together. It's putting them, uh, integrating them into a unified theory that I really don't think there's any evidence for at all. Um, so then, if it's unlikely that the United Nations is going to help us keep our population down, what's the best way to do it? Well, I don't think we should be sterilizing people. I don't think that we should be injecting people with vaccines that kill their sperm or whatever other crazy thing. I haven't heard the computer chip theory in a while. I don't know. Maybe it's because everyone's got those phones now. Whatever it is, none of those ideas sound like they're such great ideas to reduce population growth. Um, Maybe birth control. That might be a good idea. If you could break down some of the religious opposition to that. In these countries, um, in the developing world that have these huge population growth rates. I mean, I, the reality is that a lot of the world actually has replacement or declining birth rates. Russia has a declining birth rate. The developed world, Europe, Canada, Japan, the United States, we don't have these large population um, uh, growth curves and numbers. It's the areas like Africa, parts of Asia, and to a lesser extent South America that have these huge growth rate curves. And it's because nobody uses birth control. Um, and and contraception is hard to find. So, um, in terms of condoms and stuff, it's it's either looked down upon or it's just not available. So, if we could get that used more widely, that would really help us, and we don't have to kill anybody. We don't have to sterilize anyone. We can just get that kind of under control. There are organizations that the United States government has put a lot of resources into that have that aim in mind, and it's the humane way to do it. Because, like I say, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, it's a question of how you deal with it. People that advocate these organizations that want to reduce population growth at the source um, are really doing the humane approach because the alternative is what we all agree is horrific and that nobody wants to see happen. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of the NWO theorists are also um, right wing Christians and so have opposition to abortion, opposition to birth control, and they're presenting an irresolvable position. We cannot grow indefinitely, and abstention is just not going to work. So it's one or the other. Um, and I know that if in the real world sucks sometimes. Sometimes you got to make hard choices. Um, I don't find that choice particularly hard myself. I don't really see what the moral issue with abortion or especially birth control really actually is. Um, I actually understand abortion a bit better than birth control. I can't even grasp why anybody's opposed to birth control. Um, but nonetheless, there is widespread religious opposition to it, and that really, I think a lot of resources need to be put into reversing that, um, because that is the human approach, and people do need to make that choice. We can either try to prevent people from having too many kids, or you know maybe even put a law in place that says you can only have one kid. Maybe that's not so horrible when you think about it, about the possible consequences. Um, or you can deal with the fact that we're going to hit a point that's, you know, off the wall um, in terms of population growth. It's going to cause all kinds of war, and we may end up on the wrong side of it. We being people in the developed world. One way to see how that might happen is to look at the flow of refugees coming out of North Africa and the Middle East. If we fail to promote policies that reduce population growth, that's going to become normal. And then what do? When you have millions of people streaming into the industrialized world, um, and essentially taking it over. it's maybe a little bit scary. It's also a lot more realistic than theories about global governance pushing down population control tactics um, due to the difference in complexity. Um, so I mean, it's a choice, right? Um, you can either try to keep the population down, or you can deal with the consequences. It's the same choice that so many right-wing Christians in the United States have such a hard time getting their head around. It's you can allow abortions or you can pay for welfare. Which one do you want? You can't pick neither. So, I'm going to go with the um, population control people on this. But I'm going to pick the softer tactics that try to that don't infringe on people's rights. And there are ways that we can do this that are um, uh, not egregious. They do respect people's choices. It just requires making some of those hard choices. Anyways, um, it's a common theme in these conspiracy theory people. This idea of population control. You have to understand it's not actually about population control. It's about centralized government, and they use population control as a way to argue against centralized government. Um, Again, I'm neither in favor of centralized government nor of uh, these kinds of totalitarian approaches to population control. And I think it's actually really specious, given the evidence that we have, to suggest that these things have anything to do with each other. And that's really the right way to argue um, when these debates present themselves, is to try to disconnect those two ideas. Because that's ultimately what um, they're really pushing is not opposition to this population control thing, which is maybe a little bit closer than it was 50 years ago. It's not so far off anymore, and maybe they should think about that. It's opposition to global governance. That's what's really pushing it.